My name is Evan. If you've ever felt undervalued, pushed aside, or replaced by someone who couldn't tie your professional shoes, then you're going to want to hear this. For 15 years, I was the lead environmental engineer for Sterling Mining. I wasn't just an employee. I was part of the foundation. I built their compliance division from a single filing cabinet into a respected, streamlined department that kept the EPA happy and the operations profitable. I did it alongside the founder, Arthur Sterling, a tough, old-school miner who knew the earth and respected its power. But Arthur got old, and his son Colby did not. Colby was a different breed entirely. He had a freshly minted MBA, a blindingly white smile, and a vocabulary comprised entirely of buzzwords he'd learned in a seminar. When Arthur finally retired and handed the keys to the kingdom over to him, Colby's first order of business was to call me into his new minimalist office. It was all glass and chrome, a room that looked like it was actively allergic to the dust and grit of the industry it was supposed to represent. He didn't offer me a seat. He just stood there, leaning against his ridiculously expensive desk, and told me that the company was moving in a more agile, fiscally streamlined direction. He said my position, and the significant overhead associated with it, were being eliminated to cut regulatory costs. That was the phrase he used, regulatory costs. As if environmental safety was some kind of optional subscription service you could cancel to save a few bucks. He handed me a thin folder with my severance agreement, a pathetic sum that felt more like an insult than a handshake, and said HR would provide a box for my personal effects. 15 years of my life, of ensuring the water downstream of our mines ran clean, of designing reclamation plans that turned scarred land back into thriving ecosystems, of navigating the labyrinth of federal and state regulations so we could operate without incident, and it all ended with a smirking MBA grad telling me I was a cost. I didn't say much. I just nodded, took the folder, and said, "I understand." The lack of a fight seemed to unnerve him more than any outburst would have. I think he expected me to beg, or yell, or threaten. But I just felt a profound, cold calm settle over me, because there was something Colby didn't know, something even his father, in his final years, had likely forgotten he'd ever told me. Colby had just spent a fortune acquiring the drilling rights to a huge parcel of land directly adjacent to our main mine, a piece of ground known as the North Ridge. He'd been bragging about it in industry publications, calling it the company's future, a gold mine that would dwarf all their previous finds. He wasn't just wrong, he was catastrophically, company-endingly wrong. The North Ridge wasn't a gold mine, it was a tomb, a toxic one. 30 years ago, long before I ever worked there, his own father, Arthur, in a moment of youthful recklessness and desperation, had illegally buried hundreds of barrels of chemical waste on that land. It was a secret he carried like a stone in his gut for decades, a sin he confessed to me one late night over a bottle of whiskey years into my tenure. He'd told me because he trusted me, because he knew I was the only one who would understand the technical gravity of what he'd done. And he'd given me the proof, a single hand-annotated survey map marking the exact location of every last barrel. I had that map in a fireproof safe in my home office. Colby, in his arrogant quest for a quick payday, wasn't just about to drill for gold. He was about to drill straight into his father's biggest mistake, unleashing an environmental disaster that would not only bankrupt Sterling Mining, but would make my regulatory costs look like pocket change. And he'd just fired the only man on earth who could have stopped him. If you're enjoying this story so far, do me a favor and hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss what happens next. You think you know how this ends, but trust me, the reality was so much more satisfying. The drive home was the strangest part. I felt hollowed out, like someone had scooped out my insides and left an empty, echoing space. I'd driven this route 10,000 times, but today it was completely alien. The familiar landmarks, the old diner, the bridge over the creek, the turnoff for the county road, they all felt like part of a life that belonged to someone else. I kept replaying the conversation in my head. Colby's smug expression, the casual way he'd dismantled my entire professional identity in under 3 minutes. Regulatory costs. The phrase was an ice pick in my brain. It wasn't just about the money. It was the philosophy behind it. He saw the work I did, the meticulous, painstaking effort to balance industry with ecology, as nothing more than an inconvenient expense. He saw me as a line item. 15 years of loyalty, of late nights and weekends spent poring over geological surveys and water table analyses, of taking calls at 3 a.m. because a containment pond sensor was on the fritz. It all amounted to a rounding error on a spreadsheet he wanted to make look better. I pulled into my driveway and just sat in the car for a long time, the engine ticking as it cooled. The house I was living in, the life my family enjoyed, it was all built on the foundation of my career at Sterling, a career that no longer existed. What was I supposed to do now? I was in my late 50s, a specialized engineer in a niche field. Companies weren't exactly lining up to hire guys my age, especially when they could get a fresh-faced graduate for a third of the salary. That was the real quiet fear that began to creep in, the cold dread that settled in my stomach. It wasn't just about the insult, it was about the terrifying uncertainty of what came next. My wife Sarah knew something was wrong the moment I walked in the door. It was only 2 p.m. I never came home at 2 p.m. She took one look at my face and the small cardboard box in my hand, and her expression softened with a kind of sad understanding. She didn't need to ask. I just put the box down on the kitchen table and said, "Colby, let me go." She came over and wrapped her arms around me, and for the first time that day the cold hard shell of my composure started to crack. I felt the burn of unshed tears behind my eyes, the bitter sting of humiliation. I wasn't just an employee ploy. I was a company man. I believed in the work. I believed in Arthur's vision, even with its flaws. I had defended the company to skeptical friends and relatives, assuring them we were doing things the right way, and this was my reward. Over the next few days I fell into a kind of stupor. I'd wake up at my usual 5:30 a.m., out of sheer habit, my body ready to start the day, only to remember I had nowhere to go. I'd wander into my home office, a room filled with books on hydrogeology, binders of old project files, and just stare at the walls. It was a museum of a dead career. During those long quiet hours my mind kept drifting back to the past, trying to pinpoint the exact moment things had started to go wrong. It wasn't a sudden shift, it was a slow decay, like concrete spalling off an old foundation. It started when Arthur first got sick. His formidable presence at the mine began to wane, and Colby, fresh from business school, started showing up more often. At first he was just an observer, walking around in pristine brand new work boots that had never seen a speck of mud, a clipboard always in his hand. He'd attend my departmental meetings and listen with a sort of detached amusement, like a tourist watching a quaint local custom. He didn't understand the work. He didn't want to. He only understood metrics, KPIs, and profit margins. I remembered one specific incident about 3 years ago. We had a minor leak in a slurry pipeline. My team caught it within minutes thanks to the monitoring system I had designed and implemented. We enacted the emergency protocol, contained the spill to a small localized area on company property, and had the cleanup crew on site within the hour. By the time the state regulators even got the report, we had the situation completely under control. It was a textbook example of how a good compliance system is supposed to work. It prevented a small problem from becoming a multi-million-dollar catastrophe. I presented the after-action report at the next executive meeting. Arthur, who was still attending sporadically, nodded in approval. He looked at me from across the table and said, "Good work, Evan. That's why we have you." But Colby just shook his head. He looked at the cost of the cleanup, a few $1,000s for crew and materials, and said, "I'm not seeing the ROI on this, Dad. For what we spend on Evan's entire department, we could have just paid the fine." The fine, if the spill had reached the nearby creek, would have been in the 7 figures, not to mention the reputational damage and the potential for civil lawsuits. Arthur tried to explain this to him, his voice tired. He said, "Son, you're looking at the cost of the fire extinguisher, not the cost of the building burning down." Colby just shrugged, a smirk playing on his lips. He said, "Maybe we just need a fireproof building." The arrogance of that statement, the sheer profound ignorance of the forces we were dealing with every single day, it left me speechless. That was the moment I knew the company was in trouble.
That was the moment I truly understood that Colby
didn't just have a different management style, he had a fundamentally broken understanding of the world. He thought everything could be managed on a balance sheet. He didn't believe in risk, only in cost-benefit analysis. Competence isn't cheap until you lose it. The phrase echoed in my mind even then, and then there was the memory of Arthur and the map. It was about 8 years ago. We'd just successfully navigated a brutal 5-year permit renewal process. It had been a massive undertaking, and I had personally overseen every facet of it. We celebrated at a local steakhouse, just me and Arthur. He was older then, more reflective. After a couple of strong bourbons, he grew quiet. He looked at me, his eyes clouded with a memory I could tell was painful. He started talking about the early days, back in the late 70s. The company was just him, a handful of guys, and a mountain of debt. They were pulling out just enough ore to keep the lights on, but they were generating a lot of hazardous byproduct, solvents, heavy metal sludge, the nasty stuff. Disposal was expensive, prohibitively so. So one night, under the cover of darkness, he and his foreman had loaded up a flatbed truck with a few hundred barrels of the worst of it. They drove it out to the North Ridge, which was just a worthless piece of scrubland back then, dug a deep pit with a backhoe, and buried it all. He told me it was the single biggest regret of his life, a decision made by a desperate, foolish young man. A week later, he called me into his office. He slid a rolled-up tube across his desk. I opened it. It was an old geological survey map of the North Ridge, but in the corner, in Arthur's spidery handwriting, was a detailed diagram of the burial site. It had coordinates, depths, and a list of the chemicals in those barrels, chemicals I recognized as particularly nasty, carcinogenic, persistent, and highly soluble in water. I looked at him, confused. "Why are you giving this to me?" He sighed, a heavy, weary sound. He said, "Because you're the only one who understands what this really is, Evan. It's a time bomb, and you're the only one I trust to make sure it never goes off. Maybe someday, when the company is strong enough, we can do the right thing and clean it up properly. But for now, it's our secret, our cross to bear." I took the map. It felt heavy in my hands, heavy with the weight of his confession and the toxic legacy it represented. I didn't see it as leverage. I saw it as a burden, a sacred trust. I was the keeper of the company's darkest secret, tasked with ensuring it remained buried forever. My loyalty was to Arthur, to the man who had built this company, and despite his one great sin, had always tried to run it with a semblance of integrity. It was a debatable choice, I know. Some would say I should have blown the whistle right then and there, but my logic, flawed as it might have been, was rooted in that loyalty. I was protecting the man, not just the company. I was protecting the jobs of hundreds of people from the mistake of one. I hadn't thought about that map in years. It was locked away in a safe deposit box at the bank, a sleeping dragon I had no intention of ever waking. But on the 4th day after my firing, as I was scrolling aimlessly through an online mining journal, I saw it, a press release from Sterling Mining. The headline was bold and triumphant. "Sterling Mining announces acquisition of high-yield North Ridge parcel." The article was full of quotes from Colby. He was practically giddy, talking about unprecedented gold deposits and next-generation extraction techniques. He was going to fast-track the drilling. No extensive preliminary surveys. He was so sure of what was under that ground. He was going to punch holes all over that ridge, searching for his payday. My blood ran cold. The quiet dread I'd been feeling for days evaporated, replaced by something else entirely. It was a cold, sharp, and intensely focused rage. He hadn't just fired me. He had removed the single safety mechanism that stood between his blind greed and an environmental catastrophe of his own father's making. He had mistaken my quiet competence for irrelevance. He mistook loyalty for weakness. He thought I was a cost he could cut, but he had just cut the rope that was holding the sword of Damocles over his head. In that moment, sitting in the gloom of my office, the path forward became terrifyingly clear. My private breakdown was over. The resolve that replaced it was as hard and unyielding as granite. I wasn't going to call the EPA and blow the whistle. That would be too simple, too clean. No, Colby wasn't going to be stopped by a regulator's injunction. He was going to be stopped by reality. He was going to get exactly what he was drilling for, and I was going to be there to watch it happen. The catalyst wasn't just anger, it was a sudden profound sense of duty, not to the company anymore, but to the land itself, and to the people who lived downstream from it. Arthur had given me that map as insurance. It was time to cash in the policy. The first step was to retrieve the asset. Next morning I drove to the local bank, a place I usually only visited to deposit checks or access our Christmas club account. The process of getting into the safe deposit box area always felt overly dramatic. The dual keys, the clanking metal door, the hushed silence of the vault. I signed the ledger, and the bank employee, a pleasant woman named Doris, led me into the small sterile room. She used her key, then mine, and pulled out the long thin metal box. Inside, beneath my wife's heirloom jewelry and our passports, was the rolled-up cardboard tube, sealed with old yellowed tape. I took it out. It felt different in my hands now. It was no longer a burden, it was a weapon. Back in my home office, I carefully unrolled the map on my large drafting table. The paper was brittle, the lines faded, but Arthur's annotations were still sharp and clear. There it was, a crudely drawn rectangle in the northwest quadrant of the parcel, marked with a big black X. Next to it, the list of chemicals: benzene, trichloroethylene, lead compounds, a witch's brew of industrial poisons, and the date, October 1978. 30 years ago. I spent the rest of the day cross-referencing the old survey map with modern satellite imagery and geological data I had from my own files. Sterling Mining had strict data security protocols, but they were designed to prevent corporate espionage from the outside, not to stop a terminated executive from walking out the door with the knowledge he'd accumulated over 15 years. I had backups of my most critical project files on a personal hard drive, not out of malice, but out of professional diligence. I'd often worked from home, and it was simply more efficient. Now that diligence was about to pay off. I overlaid the burial site coordinates onto a topographical map of the North Ridge. The pit was located on a slight incline, directly above a porous layer of sandstone that I knew fed into the aquifer that supplied water to the entire valley, including the small town of Northwood, a few miles downstream. A breach wouldn't just be a localized spill, it would be a systemic poisoning of the entire region's water table, a slow, silent, and devastating catastrophe. Colby wasn't just drilling into a few barrels, he was drilling into an artery. My next call was to Benjamin Carter. Ben was a retired corporate lawyer, a friend I'd made over years of playing golf at the local country club. He was sharp, cynical, and had a healthy disrespect for corporate hubris. I told him I needed to talk, that it was important. We met for lunch at a quiet pub on the edge of town. I laid out the situation, starting with my firing and ending with the map. I didn't show it to him, not yet. I just described it. He listened patiently, stirring his iced tea, his expression unreadable. When I finished, he took a long sip and set his glass down. He said, "So, let me get this straight. The new boy king fires you, the one man who knows where the bodies are buried, literally, so he can go dig for treasure on top of the cemetery. That's a level of beautiful poetic stupidity you don't see every day." I nodded. That about sums it up. He leaned forward. "And what, exactly, do you want to do, Evan? Do you want to sue for wrongful termination? We could make a case, but age discrimination is hard to prove. They'll just say it was a business decision. Do you want to send the map to the EPA? You'd be a hero for a week, but Colby's lawyers would paint you as a disgruntled employee out for revenge. It would get messy." I shook my head. "No, neither of those. I want to be ready." He raised an eyebrow. "Ready for what?" "For the inevitable." I explained my idea. I wasn't going to prevent the disaster. I was going to position myself to manage the fallout. I wanted to start my own environmental consulting firm. When Colby strikes those barrels, and he will, Sterling Mining is going to need the best possible help to contain the damage. They're going to be radioactive, both literally and figuratively. No reputable firm will want to touch them. Except one. Mine. Ben's face broke into a slow, wide grin. He leaned back in his booth and let out a low whistle. Evan, you magnificent bastard. That's not just revenge. That's a business plan. For the next hour we sketched it out on a napkin. We talked about liability, incorporation, and strategy. He went over my severance agreement with a fine-tooth comb. The non-compete clause was laughably broad, basically stating I couldn't work in the extractive industries anywhere in North America for 2 years. Ben chuckled as he read it. This is unenforceable garbage. It's a scare tactic. They know it, and we know it. As long as you don't actively poach their clients while you're on their payroll, you're fine. And since they terminated you, they've lost most of their leverage. The severance itself was just 2 weeks' pay. 2 weeks for 15 years. Ben called it a go-away check, designed to be just enough to make a lawsuit seem like too much trouble. It was a classic corporate maneuver, insulting and legally just barely defensible. This conversation was a masterclass in the kind of plausible inaccuracies that fuels online debates. Ben's interpretation of the non-compete was aggressive, something another lawyer might dispute, but it was exactly the kind of confident strategic advice I needed to hear. He was giving me the legal and moral justification to proceed. The final piece of my plan involved a more personal kind of asset. I needed eyes and ears inside the company. I thought of Maria Flores. I had hired Maria straight out of university 5 years ago. She was a brilliant geologist, sharp, dedicated, and possessed a healthy skepticism of authority that I always admired. She saw through Colby's corporate facade from day one. I had mentored her, taught her everything I knew about the practical application of her degree in a corporate environment. I trusted her implicitly. I sent her a text, asking if she was free for a coffee. We met the next day. I told her I'd been let go. She was furious on my behalf. She said the atmosphere at the mine had become toxic ever since Colby took full control. Morale was in the gutter. He was all about cutting corners, pushing timelines, and ignoring the concerns of the experienced engineers. He'd replaced me with a kid, a recent graduate from his alma mater, who apparently thought a soil sampling protocol was a type of new salsa. She said they're flying blind, Evan. And Colby is the one at the controls. I leaned in and lowered my voice. Maria, I need to ask you for something. It's a big ask, and I'll understand if you say no. I need you to stay. I need you to be my source. Tell me what's happening on the ground at the North Ridge. Tell me about the drilling, the protocols, the mood. I need to know what's coming. She looked at me, her dark eyes searching my face. She knew this was more than just professional curiosity. She didn't ask why, she just nodded. Of course, Evan, for you, anything. Colby might have bought the loyalty of a few sycophants with promotions and bonuses, but the real loyalty, the kind built on years of mutual respect and mentorship, that was something he could never understand, let alone purchase. My ally network was small, but it was solid. A savvy lawyer and a loyal insider. The next few weeks were a flurry of activity. Ben handled the legal side, filing the paperwork to incorporate Bedrock Environmental Solutions LLC. The name felt right. Solid, fundamental, reliable. Everything that Sterling Mining was no longer. I converted my home office into a proper command center, setting up a dedicated server, business phone lines, and accounting software. I secured a small business loan from the local credit union, using my modest 401k as collateral. It was a risk, but every calculation I made told me the payoff would be substantial. The biggest strategic move I made during that time was subtle. I composed a carefully worded email and sent it to the personal accounts of the 2 senior VPs at our largest clients, Kestrel Materials and Apex Aggregates. These were men I had worked with for over a decade. We had built relationships based on trust and results. My email was simple and direct. I informed them that I was no longer with Sterling Mining and had started my own independent consultancy. I wished them and Sterling all the best. I didn't ask for their business. I didn't disparage my former employer.
I just stated the facts. It was a quiet, professional announcement. Within a day, both of them had replied. Their responses were variations on the same theme. They were shocked and concerned to hear of my departure. They expressed their deep respect for my work over the years and noted that my oversight was a significant factor in their long-standing relationship with Sterling. They both ended with a similar line. "Keep us apprised of your new venture, Evan. We're very interested." It was perfect. I hadn't poached anyone. I had simply reminded them where the real value in their relationship with Sterling had resided. It hadn't been in the logo on the letterhead. It had been in the competence of the man managing their projects. I had planted the seeds of doubt. Now, all I had to do was wait for Colby to water them. The updates from Maria started coming in daily. They were like dispatches from the front line of a slow-motion disaster. Colby was pushing the drilling team hard. He was on site every day, a constant, agitating presence. He'd bypassed the standard multi-phase geological survey, claiming it was an unnecessary delay. He'd hired a cheap drilling contractor known for being fast, not careful. Maria's texts were a chronicle of escalating recklessness. Day 3. They hit a pocket of shale they weren't expecting. Snapped a drill bit. Colby blamed the contractor. Day 5. The new environmental lead signed off on the water runoff plan without even walking the site. I saw him filling it out in the truck. Day 7. We're getting some weird pressure fluctuations in drill hole number 4. I flagged it in my report. My supervisor told me Colby doesn't want to see problems, he wants to see progress. I could picture the scene perfectly. Colby strutting around the drill site in his designer sunglasses, shouting about synergy and timelines, completely oblivious to the geological reality churning just a few hundred feet beneath his feet. He was a man playing chess without understanding how the pieces moved. He saw the land as a passive resource, a static object to be exploited. He didn't understand it was a living, complex system, full of pressures and tensions, a system that always pushes back when you disrespect it. My days were a strange mix of mundane startup tasks and high-stakes waiting. 1 hour I'd be on the phone with an insurance agent, arguing about liability coverage. The next I'd be staring at the satellite map on my screen, tracking the progress of the drill rig as it moved across the North Ridge, getting closer and closer to the X's on Arthur's map. It was like watching a shark swim towards a swimmer, powerless to shout a warning, and knowing that you were the only one who had a lifeboat ready. The first real sign of trouble came on the 10th day of drilling. Maria called me on her lunch break, her voice low and tense. "Evan, they hit something. Not rock. The drill rig experienced a sudden drop in pressure, a void, and the air. There's a smell. It's faint like a solvent. The crew is getting nervous. Colby's telling everyone it's just a natural gas pocket." My heart hammered in my chest. "This is it." I told her. "Be careful, Maria. Document everything. Times, locations, what people say. Send it to me on your personal email. Don't use the company network." She agreed. The silent takeover was entering its next phase. The trap had been set 30 years ago. The bait was Colby's own greed, and the spring was about to be triggered.
The call I had been waiting for came 2 days later. It wasn't from Maria. It was from Ben, my lawyer. He sounded grim. "Turn on the local news, Evan." I flipped on the small TV in my office. The lead story was breaking news. A hazardous material incident at the Sterling Mining North Ridge site. The aerial footage showed it all. A sickly, iridescent sheen was spreading out from one of the drill holes, pooling on the ground. Men in full hazmat suits were swarming the area. The site was cordoned off with yellow tape. The EPA was on site. The reporter was saying that the company spokesperson Colby was claiming it was a minor, contained diesel fuel spill from a piece of heavy equipment. A lie, a stupid, transparent lie that anyone with a basic knowledge of chemicals could see through. Diesel fuel doesn't look like that. Diesel fuel doesn't make trained emergency responders wear full-face respirators. I felt a cold, grim satisfaction. The bomb had gone off. An hour later, my personal cell phone rang. It was Maria. She was speaking quickly, her voice a mixture of fear and vindicated anger. "It's a catastrophe, Evan. The drill punched right through one of the barrels. The sludge came up the borehole like a geyser. The smell was overpowering. 2 of the drill crew guys got it on their boots and have been taken to the hospital with chemical burns. Colby is in full panic mode. He's trying to lock the site down, keep the media out, but it's too late. The EPA investigator took one look at the sample and practically quarantined the whole county." She paused, taking a breath. "I quit, Evan. I walked into the site office, handed my supervisor my resignation, and told him I would not be an accessory to this. I'm emailing you my full report, including photos. I'm out." "Good," I said, my voice calm and steady. "Welcome to Bedrock Environmental. You start Monday." There was a pause on the other end, and I could hear the relief in her voice. "Thank you, Evan. Thank you." The first domino had fallen, the talent exodus had begun. I knew that in a crisis, people don't follow titles, they follow competence. Maria was the first, but she wouldn't be the last. The best people at Sterling, the engineers, geologists and technicians who actually knew what they were doing, they had no loyalty to Colby. They would see this disaster not as a company problem, but as a leadership failure of epic proportions, and they would run from it like a burning building. Over the next 48 hours, my phone didn't stop ringing. 2 senior project engineers and a hydrologist, all people I had trained and respected, called me. They had all resigned. They described a scene of pure chaos at the corporate office. Colby was shouting at people, blaming everyone but himself. Legal was in lockdown. HR was trying to draft statements that said nothing. The company was imploding. And then the call I was truly waiting for. It came on a Sunday afternoon. The caller ID showed Sterling Mining Mine. I let it ring 4 times, then answered with a calm, neutral Evan speaking. The voice on the other end was frantic, unrecognizable from the cool, condescending executive who had fired me just a few weeks ago. It was Colby. "Evan, thank God. Listen, we have a situation here. A minor situation. There's been a spill at the Northridge site. Minor situation." The lie was so pathetic it was almost funny. I stayed silent, letting him squirm in the quiet. "Look," he continued, his voice cracking. "I know we had our differences, a misunderstanding, but you know that land better than anyone. I need you to come back. We can work something out. A new title, Senior Vice President of Environmental Affairs. A significant pay increase. Whatever you want. We need you to fix this." The desperation was a tangible thing, a foul stench coming through the phone. He was offering me the very promotion he had denied me for years, the very respect he had refused to give. He wasn't offering it out of a change of heart. He was offering it because his world was on fire, and he thought I was the only one with a fire hose. The power shift was complete. He was no longer the king in his glass castle. He was just a scared boy who had stumbled into his father's mess. I let the silence stretch for a few more seconds, enjoying the sound of his ragged breathing. Then I said, "I don't think that will be possible, Colby. I'm no longer looking for a job." There was a stunned silence. "What do you mean? What are you talking about?" "I am, however, the principal consultant for a firm that specializes in large-scale environmental remediation. If Sterling Mining would like to retain our services, you can have your legal counsel contact my legal counsel. His name is Benjamin Carter. I'm sure you have his number." And with that I hung up. I sat there in my office, the phone still in my hand, and allowed myself a small tight smile. The game had changed. I wasn't a pawn anymore. I was the one controlling the board. The meeting was set for the following Tuesday. Colby had wanted to meet at the Sterling Mining headquarters on his turf. I refused. Ben, my lawyer, had insisted on a neutral location. We chose the conference room of a downtown law firm that Ben used for mediations. It was a place of quiet, understated power, all dark wood and leather-bound books. It was a world away from the grit of the mine and the sterile modernism of Colby's office. It was my world now. I arrived with Ben and Maria. Maria was there as my lead technical expert. She had her report, a thick damning document filled with chemical analyses, photographs, and a detailed timeline of the negligence she had witnessed. She was composed, professional, and radiated an aura of unshakable competence. We sat on one side of the long mahogany table. A few minutes later, Colby arrived with 2 lawyers in tow. He looked terrible. His expensive suit was rumpled, his face was pale, and he had dark circles under his eyes. The cocksure MBA was gone, replaced by a man who looked like he hadn't slept in a week. He tried to start with a handshake and some weak pleasantries, but Ben cut him off. "Let's dispense with the theatrics, shall we? Your client has a problem. My client has a solution. Let's discuss terms." Colby's lawyer, a slick-looking man in his 40s, began to speak, but I held up a hand. "I want to hear it from him," I said, looking directly at Colby. Colby flinched, but he took the cue. "Look, Evan, we made a mistake. We need your help. The EPA has frozen all our assets pending the cleanup plan. Our stock has lost 60% of its value. The board is calling for my head. What do you want?" This was the moment, the culmination of 15 years of loyalty, 1 act of profound betrayal, and a few weeks of cold hard strategy. I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It was the proposal for services from Bedrock Environmental Solutions. Ben had drafted it, and it was a work of art. The terms were simple, and they were non-negotiable. 1. Bedrock Environmental would be granted the exclusive, 10-year contract to oversee the assessment, containment, and full remediation of the North Ridge site. 2. Bedrock would have full operational autonomy. My decisions on methodology, personnel, and budget would be final and not subject to review by Sterling's management. I would report directly to the EPA and the board, not to Colby. 3. The contract would be billed at a premium rate, a full 30% above the industry standard, with a significant 7-figure retainer paid up front to cover initial mobilization costs. 4. Sterling Mining would issue a public unreserved apology, taking full responsibility for the disaster. The statement would be personally signed by Colby Sterling as CEO. And 5. The final term, the one that was purely for me. Sterling Mining would make a one-time lump sum payment into a retirement fund for myself, Maria Flores, and the 3 other engineers who had resigned. The payment would be equal to the full vested pension amount we would have received had we retired from the company after 30 years of service. It was a quiet, brutal checkmate. Colby's lawyers stared at the paper, their mouths slightly agape. One of them started to bluster. This is outrageous. It's extortion." Ben just smiled, a thin wolfish grin. "Extortion is a strong word. I prefer market correction. Your client created a unique market demand for a very specific set of skills. My client is simply meeting that demand at a price commensurate with its value. You can of course refuse, and you can try to find another firm with Mr. Sterling's unique historical knowledge of the site's peculiarities. I'm sure the EPA and your shareholders will be very patient while you conduct that search." Colby just stared at me, his eyes pleading. "Evan, please, my father. This would destroy everything he built." The mention of his father was a mistake. I leaned forward, my voice low and cold for his ears only. "Your father built this company on hard work and a deep respect for the ground he worked on. He made one mistake, a mistake he regretted for the rest of his life. You built your short, disastrous tenure on arrogance and spreadsheets. You didn't just ignore his wisdom, you spat on it. You are destroying his company. I'm the one who's going to save a piece of it from the wreckage you created." I stood up. "You have 24 hours to sign. Ben has my number." And with that we walked out, leaving them to stare at the single piece of paper that represented their unconditional surrender. The new workplace reality had been established. I wasn't the employee anymore. I was the boss. The news that they had signed the contract came the next morning. It wasn't a surprise. They had no other move to make. My old company was now my first and biggest client. The irony was so thick you could cut it with a knife. The resolution wasn't a single dramatic event. It was a slow, methodical process, which is how all real work gets done. My firm, Bedrock Environmental, took over the North Ridge site. We brought in the best equipment,
And more importantly, the best people. The other engineers who had quit Sterling came to work for me, their relief palpable. We were a team again, but this time we were working for a mission we all believed in, unencumbered by corporate politics or an ignorant boss.
The work was hard. The cleanup was complex and dangerous, but we were good at it. We contained the plume, began the long process of excavating the barrels, and started treating the contaminated soil and groundwater. Every day was a challenge, but it was a challenge we met with competence and professionalism. Colby was forced to make his public apology. It was a humiliating spectacle. He read the statement I had personally approved, his voice flat and defeated. A few weeks later, the board of directors finally acted. Colby was removed as CEO. The official reason was for health reasons, the classic corporate euphemism for a catastrophic failure of leadership. He was gone, erased. The company, now a shell of its former self, was eventually acquired by a larger competitor. The Sterling mining name, once a source of pride for me, vanished from the industry. My office now is in a modest but modern building downtown. It's clean, well lit, and everything in it is something I chose and paid for. On the wall behind my desk, I have the old survey map professionally framed under museum-quality glass. It's not a secret anymore. It's a reminder that the truth, like groundwater, always finds its way to the surface. It's a reminder that loyalty is a two-way street, and it's a reminder that arrogance has a price, and sometimes the bill comes due in the most spectacular way. I didn't set out to destroy Colby or his company. I never made a single anonymous phone call or leaked a single document to the press. I didn't have to. I just stepped out of the way and let his own ignorance and arrogance run their natural course. I built a lifeboat, and when he scuttled his own ship, I was there to rescue the survivors who were worth saving. My vindication wasn't in his failure but in my own success, built on the very principles he'd mocked. So what's the moral of the story? I guess it's that competence is the ultimate form of leverage. In a world full of people who talk a good game, the person who can actually do the work holds the real power. They can take your job, they can take your title, they can take your desk, but they can never take what you know. They mistook my long years of service for complacency. They saw institutional knowledge as an outdated liability, but in the end that knowledge was the one thing they couldn't afford to lose. Never let anyone tell you that your experience is a cost. It's an asset, the most valuable one you have. For anyone out there who has ever been overlooked, underestimated, or told you were a cost, remember this: your value isn't determined by someone else's spreadsheet. It's determined by what you can do, what you know, and the integrity with which you do it. Build your skills, nurture your professional relationships, and always keep your own records, because you never know when you'll need to start your own lifeboat. Thank you for listening to my story. If it resonated with you, I'd appreciate it if you'd like this video. Leave a comment below and tell me about a time you saw competence win the day. Share this with someone who needs to hear it, and don't forget to hit that subscribe button for more stories about the quiet victories that really matter.